She didn't belong in a room where even silence felt expensive. The kind of silence that came with marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and conversations spoken just loud enough to remind everyone who had power and who did not. Inside the grand Manhattan Gala Hall, dressed in gold and white light, guests moved like they had been rehearsing their elegance their entire lives, until the front doors opened and everything subtly changed. A small girl stepped in. Her name was Ava Johnson, 8 years old, standing at the threshold as if she had accidentally walked into a world that was not designed to notice her. Her dress was torn at the hem, not enough to define her, but enough for the room to define her with it. Her shoes were worn down from distance that no one in that room had ever needed to walk. For half a second, no one spoke, and then the whispers began, soft at first, like a breeze slipping through an open window, then heavier, sharper, like judgment learning how to breathe. Ava did not move backward. She did not lower her head. She simply walked forward, step by step, as if the floor beneath her belonged to her just as much as anyone else in the room. At the center of the hall stood Richard Hale, 45 years old, billionaire investor and owner of Hale Meridian Group, a man whose presence alone was enough to quiet entire boardrooms. He turned slowly as the noise shifted around him, his eyes locking onto the child as if she were an unexpected variable in a system he believed he had already solved. A faint expression of disbelief crossed his face before settling into something colder, more controlled. "Who let her in here?" he said, not loudly, but clearly enough that the nearest conversation stopped mid-sentence. A few guests exchanged uneasy glances. No one answered immediately, because no one wanted responsibility for the moment. Ava stopped a few yards away from him. The distance between them felt larger than the room itself. Her hands stayed at her sides. She did not fidget. She did not explain herself. The silence she carried was not empty. It was intentional, like she had learned that words were only useful when someone was willing to hear them. Richard studied her, his gaze moving briefly over her torn dress, her posture, her stillness. Something about her refusal to shrink created a discomfort he did not immediately recognize. One of the event organizers stepped forward quickly, trying to fill the gap with polite urgency, but Richard raised a hand slightly, stopping him without looking away from the girl. The crowd waited for the moment she would break, for the tears, for the apology, for the story that would make her presence make sense in a place like this. But Ava did none of those things. Instead, she lifted her chin just slightly, as if acknowledging that she understood exactly what everyone was thinking and had already decided it did not matter. "I didn't come to impress anyone," she said quietly, her voice small but steady enough to cut through the tension. That single sentence shifted something in the atmosphere. Not enough for anyone to relax, but enough for Richard to pause in a way that was almost imperceptible. He had seen confidence in adults who spent millions trying to manufacture it, but in a child standing alone in a room like this, it felt different, unfiltered, unprotected. One of the guests let out a soft laugh, unsure whether it was appropriate or not, and then stopped when no one joined. The sound of uncertainty spread instead, replacing certainty itself. Ava did not react. She simply looked around the room, as if observing a place that had already decided what she was without asking her a single question. Richard took a slow step forward, not toward her, but into the space between them, narrowing the invisible gap that the room seemed to be exaggerating. His expression remained controlled, but something behind his eyes shifted slightly, like a calculation that no longer returned the expected result. He had built his life on reading people in seconds, yet this child did not fit any category he recognized. The torn dress should have told him everything he needed to dismiss her. The silence should have made her easy to remove from the situation. But instead, it made her harder to ignore. Behind her, the double doors of the gala closed softly, sealing her inside the moment with no visible way out, while the chandeliers above continued to glow as if nothing unusual had entered at all. Ava remained still, waiting, not for permission, but for whatever would come next, as Richard Hale stood across from her in a room full of watching eyes that were slowly beginning to understand that something about this night was no longer following its expected rules. The tension in the ballroom did not disappear after Ava spoke. Instead, it spread quietly from table to table like a ripple that no one admitted to noticing. Guests shifted in their places, pretending to continue conversations that no longer held their attention, their eyes returning again and again to the small girl standing in the center of the polished marble floor. The gala staff moved with careful urgency, trying to restore the rhythm of the evening, but the rhythm had already fractured. A man in a dark suit stepped closer to Richard Hale and spoke in a lowered voice, suggesting that the situation could be handled discreetly, that the child could be guided out before the event continued to lose focus. Richard did not answer immediately. His gaze remained fixed on Ava, who stood exactly where she had stopped, as if the room itself had paused around her and she had decided not to move until it started again. There was no fear in her posture, only patience, and that patience began to disturb him more than any protest or explanation would have. One of the guests let out a soft remark about inappropriate presence, quickly followed by another voice agreeing under breath, and soon the judgment in the room grew heavier, more confident, as if repetition could turn discomfort into certainty. Richard finally shifted his attention slightly, not breaking eye contact with the girl, but acknowledging the man beside him with a brief glance that carried enough authority to silence further suggestion. He did not say yes or no, but the absence of permission was enough for no one to act. Ava lowered her eyes briefly, not in submission, but as if observing the floor itself, tracing the faint patterns in the marble with quiet focus. Then she looked up again, her expression unchanged, and that steadiness created an unfamiliar discomfort in Richard's chest. He had expected distress, confusion, maybe even pleading, but instead he was confronted with composure that did not belong in a child standing alone under so many watching eyes. The contrast between her torn dress and her stillness became impossible to ignore, each detail amplifying the other until the room itself seemed to highlight her presence rather than diminish it. Richard took another step forward, slower this time, and stopped a few feet away from her. Up close, the imperfections in her clothing were more visible, but so was something else, something deliberate in the way she carried herself, as if the condition of her appearance had nothing to do with the condition of her worth. Ava did not step back when he approached, she only tilted her head slightly, meeting his gaze directly for the first time. Around them, the gala continued to hold its breath, conversations fading into background noise that no one fully controlled anymore. Richard's expression tightened slightly as he noticed a small detail he had overlooked before, the careful stitching along the edge of her dress, not careless damage, but repaired fabric, mended by someone who had tried to preserve what they could. That detail lingered longer than expected in his thoughts, refusing to fit neatly into the assumption he had made seconds earlier. A woman near the front whispered that it was inappropriate for a child to be present in such condition at an event of this level, and although the words were meant to reinforce agreement, they instead deepened the silence that followed. Ava finally spoke again, her voice still soft but steady enough to reach the space between judgments. "I am not here by mistake," she said simply, and the statement did not sound like defense, it sounded like fact. Richard felt a slight shift in his perspective, subtle but undeniable, as if a line he had not known existed had just been crossed. The man beside him again suggested that they proceed with removing her from the floor, more insistently this time. But Richard raised his hand slightly, without looking away from Ava, signaling a pause that carried more weight than any instruction. For the first time that evening, he was not reacting as a host or an authority, but as someone trying to understand something that did not align with expectation. Ava remained still, her hands relaxed at her sides, her presence unchanged by the growing tension around her. The chandeliers above continued to shine, indifferent to the quiet unraveling beneath them, while Richard Hale stood in the center of it all, realizing that whatever this moment was becoming, it was no longer something he could dismiss without consequence. The room remained suspended in an uneasy stillness, as if the entire gala had shifted into a state where even sound was careful about existing. Ava Johnson still stood at the center of the marble floor, her small figure surrounded by towering guests in formal wear, none of whom seemed certain whether to continue observing or pretend nothing had happened. Richard Hale had not moved away, and that alone had begun to change the energy in the room. People who had once looked at the child with quiet dismissal were now watching the billionaire instead, trying to interpret why he had not immediately resolved the situation. Ava's presence no longer felt like an interruption, but like an unanswered question that no one wanted to speak aloud. Richard's gaze remained steady on her, but his attention was no longer on her appearance. It had shifted to her composure, to the way she stood, as if the judgment of a room full of strangers had no authority over her internal balance. That realization unsettled him in a way he did not immediately acknowledge. He had spent his life reading environments, measuring people in seconds, categorizing them in ways that allowed him to predict outcomes. Yet this child did not fit into any familiar structure. One of the gala organizers stepped forward again, more cautious than before, holding a thin envelope in his hand, as if offering an explanation that might dissolve the tension. He spoke softly to Richard, suggesting again that the situation could be handled privately, that the child's presence might have been a misunderstanding. Richard did not take the envelope. Instead, his eyes narrowed slightly as he continued to observe Ava. For the first time, he noticed something in her expression that had not been visible before, not vulnerability, but restraint, as if she was deliberately holding something back rather than waiting to be rescued from the moment. Ava's attention drifted briefly toward the crowd, then returned to Richard, and in that exchange there was no pleading, no confusion, only expectation that he would eventually see what she already understood. The murmurs in the room grew softer, not because they disappeared, but because they were losing confidence. People were no longer certain how to categorize what they were witnessing. A child who refused to break under attention did not fit into the narrative they had instinctively chosen. Richard finally spoke again, his voice lower than before, directed more toward Ava than anyone else. "Where did you come from tonight?" he asked, not as an accusation, but as a genuine attempt to place her within context. Ava hesitated only briefly before answering, her voice calm and precise. "I was invited," she said. The answer created another ripple of confusion among the guests. Invitations to events like this were controlled, curated, tracked, and no one present recalled approving a child matching her description. Richard turned his head slightly toward the organizer beside him, who immediately stiffened, sensing the implied question without needing words. The man began to explain quickly that all invited guests were verified, that no record existed of a child entry under her name. Richard listened without interruption, but his focus kept returning to Ava, who had not reacted to the discussion around her identity as if it carried no immediate threat to her standing in the room. Instead, she shifted her weight slightly and looked down for a moment, as if recalling something internal rather than external. When she looked back up, her expression carried a faint certainty that made Richard's attention sharpen further. The envelope in the organizer's hand slipped slightly as he adjusted his grip, and in that small movement, Richard's eyes caught something new. A second envelope, smaller, partially visible near Ava's side, held carefully in place against the torn fabric of her dress. It had not been noticed before because it blended too easily with the worn texture of her clothing. Richard's focus locked onto it immediately. Ava noticed his gaze and followed it down briefly, then back up, without reacting defensively. Instead, she seemed to anticipate that this moment would eventually arrive. The surrounding guests leaned in slightly, sensing that something unspoken was about to surface, though no one could yet define what it was. Richard did not reach for the envelope immediately. Instead, he studied Ava's face again, as if recalibrating every assumption he had made in the last several minutes. The earlier dismissal that had briefly existed in his tone was gone now, replaced by something more cautious, something that resembled uncertainty. Ava spoke again before anyone else could intervene. "You can look at it if you want," she said quietly. The simplicity of the statement created a stillness that spread across the room more effectively than any instruction could have. Richard hesitated for a fraction of a second longer than anyone expected, then extended his hand toward the small envelope. As his fingers closed around it, the entire gala seemed to tighten in anticipation, unaware that whatever was inside was about to shift the balance of everything that had been assumed since the moment the child had entered the room. Richard Hale held the small envelope between his fingers without opening it immediately, as if the weight of it was not paper but consequence. The entire ballroom remained suspended in a silence that felt unnatural in a place designed for constant motion, music, and conversation. Ava Johnson stood exactly where she had been, watching him, her expression unchanged, neither expectant nor anxious, only present, as if what happened next had already been decided long before anyone else realized it. Richard finally broke the seal with a slow, controlled motion, his eyes lowering as the paper unfolded. Around him, guests instinctively leaned forward or shifted slightly, pretending not to watch while doing exactly that. The moment his eyes scanned the first lines, something subtle changed in his posture, not dramatic, not visible to the untrained eye, but enough for those closest to him to notice that his breathing had altered. The room did not understand what they were witnessing, only that the man who rarely reacted to anything was now reading something that had interrupted his control. Ava did not move. She simply observed him reading, as if she already knew what the reaction would be but had chosen to wait for confirmation. The silence stretched until one of the guests attempted a nervous laugh, unsure whether the moment was serious or misunderstood, but the sound faded quickly when no one responded. Richard turned the paper slightly, reading again, slower this time, as if verifying that the words had not changed on their own. A faint tension appeared in his jaw, not anger, but recognition. The organizer beside him shifted uncomfortably, trying to interpret what was happening without asking directly. Richard did not hand the letter to anyone else. Instead, he folded it carefully, not with dismissal, but with precision, as though preserving it. Then he looked up. His gaze did not immediately go to the crowd. It went directly to Ava. For the first time since she entered the room, the power dynamic between them had shifted in a way that was not immediately visible, but deeply felt. The billionaire who had been controlling the atmosphere of the gala was now no longer fully in control of his own attention. Ava met his eyes without hesitation, and in that exchange there was no fear, only continuity, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment from the beginning. Richard took a slow breath and stepped slightly to the side, creating space around himself that had not been there before. The guests interpreted it differently, some thinking he was preparing to address the room, others believing he might dismiss the situation entirely. Instead, he looked at the organizer again and said nothing for several seconds, allowing the silence to deepen further. Then he spoke, his voice lower than before, no longer carrying the same detached authority. "This letter is not what I expected," he said simply. The statement did not clarify anything, but it shifted the energy in the room from judgment to uncertainty. Ava's expression remained steady, though something in her eyes softened slightly, not relief, but acknowledgement that the message had reached its intended recipient. Richard glanced down once more at the folded paper in his hand, then back at her. "Where did you get this?" he asked, slower now, as if choosing each word carefully. Ava hesitated for the first time since the encounter began, but only for a moment. "From someone who said you would understand," she replied. The words landed quietly, but they carried a weight that no one in the room could immediately decode. A few guests exchanged confused looks, trying to piece together meaning from fragments, while others simply watched Richard, waiting for his reaction to define their own. He did not answer right away. Instead, he studied Ava again, and for the first time since the gala began, his expression no longer reflected certainty. It reflected something closer to reconsideration. The child in front of him was no longer just an unexpected presence in a formal space. She had become the center of something he had not yet fully identified, something that disrupted the boundaries of assumption he usually relied on. Ava shifted her gaze briefly toward the envelope in his hand, then back to his face, as if confirming that it had been delivered correctly. Richard finally exhaled slowly and turned slightly away from the crowd, not leaving the moment, but stepping just enough outside of it to think. The guests remained frozen in their positions, unsure whether the situation had escalated or resolved, but sensing that neither explanation fit what was unfolding. Ava remained still, waiting, not for approval, not for permission, but for the next truth to surface. And in that space between certainty and revelation, Richard Hale stood holding a letter that had already begun to change the way he saw everything inside the room. Richard Hale remained still for several seconds after reading the letter, as if the words had anchored him to a different version of the room that no one else could see. The gala continued around him in fragments of motion and silence, guests pretending to resume their conversations while constantly watching the center where Ava Johnson stood unchanged. The paper in his hand no longer felt like an object of curiosity, but like something that had already rewritten the atmosphere without permission. Slowly, Richard folded it once more and placed it inside his inner jacket pocket, a gesture that caused a few nearby guests to exchange uncertain glances, because it was not the reaction they had expected from a man known for immediate decisions and clear outcomes. Ava watched him do it without speaking, her expression steady, as if the result had been accounted for long before it occurred. Richard finally turned his body slightly away from the crowd, not toward the exit, but toward Ava, closing the distance between them with measured steps. The room reacted subtly to this movement, as people tried to interpret whether the situation was being resolved or deepened. When he stopped in front of her, the scale difference between them became even more pronounced, not in height or presence, but in silence. Ava did not look up immediately. She waited, and that patience seemed to unsettle him more than any demand would have. Then Richard spoke, his voice lower, no longer carrying the tone of authority that had defined him earlier. "Come with me," he said simply. The words did not sound like an order, and they did not sound like a request either, but something in between that shifted responsibility without explanation. Ava did not ask where. She only nodded once and stepped forward. The movement caused a small stir among the guests, a collective hesitation as they realized the moment was no longer contained within observation. Richard turned and began walking toward a side corridor that led away from the main hall, and after a brief pause, Ava followed him. The sound of their footsteps on the polished floor replaced the ambient music of the gala, creating a quiet rhythm that stood out against the frozen attention of the room. As they moved farther from the center, the light softened slightly, transitioning from bright chandeliers to dimmer hallway illumination. Richard did not speak immediately, and Ava did not ask questions, but the silence between them was no longer heavy in the same way. It was structured, intentional, like a space forming for something not yet defined. When they reached a quieter section near a closed set of doors, Richard stopped and turned toward her again. For a moment, he simply observed her, not as a child in an unexpected setting, but as the source of something that had interrupted his understanding of control. He reached into his pocket briefly, touching the folded letter again without removing it, as if confirming its presence. Ava noticed the gesture but did not comment. Instead, she looked toward the door behind him, then back at his face, waiting for what came next without pressure. Richard exhaled slowly, a breath that carried more weight than anything he had said all evening. "You were not supposed to be treated the way you were treated in there," he said finally, his voice quieter now, stripped of the earlier detachment. Ava tilted her head slightly, acknowledging the statement without reacting emotionally to it. "I am fine," she replied simply, as if the events of the gala had not altered her internal state in the way others might assume. That answer made Richard pause again, because it did not match the narrative he had already begun forming in his mind. He studied her for another moment, then shifted his stance slightly, as if deciding something that required more than logic. Behind them, the distant sound of the gala continued, muffled and distant, like another world that had not yet realized it had lost its center of gravity. Richard finally made a decision that was visible not in words, but in movement. He turned slightly toward the corridor leading further away from the event and gestured for Ava to follow once more. She did so without hesitation, and as they walked together away from the bright center of the evening, the distance between assumption and truth seemed to widen behind them, leaving the unanswered question of the letter still resting quietly inside his pocket, waiting for the moment it would no longer remain unread. The corridor they walked through felt increasingly distant from the gala behind them, as if each step Richard Hale took with Ava Johnson was pulling them further away from the world that had defined the evening. The sound of music and conversation had faded into a low, indistinct hum, replaced by the quiet rhythm of footsteps on polished stone and carpeted hallway. Richard did not speak for several moments, his attention divided between the child beside him and the weight of the folded letter still secured inside his inner jacket pocket. Ava walked slightly behind him now, not out of hesitation but out of instinct, as if she understood that the space between them was part of an unspoken structure she was respecting rather than fearing. They turned into a narrower passage that led away from the public event areas, and the lighting shifted again, becoming warmer but more subdued, casting softer shadows along the walls. At the end of the corridor, Richard stopped in front of a set of double doors that led into a private office reserved for executive use during events held at the building. He placed his hand on the handle, but did not open it immediately, as if reconsidering the transition from public observation to private reality. Ava waited silently behind him. After a brief pause, he pushed the doors open and stepped inside, allowing her to follow. The office was large but minimal, designed more for function than display. A long table stood near the center, a few leather chairs arranged with precision, and large windows overlooked the city skyline of Manhattan, where lights from surrounding buildings created a slow, constant movement beyond the glass. Richard walked toward the window first, as if needing distance before addressing anything further. Ava remained near the entrance, observing the space without touching anything, her attention moving briefly across the room before settling on him again. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and the silence felt different from the one in the ballroom. This silence was not imposed by expectation, but created by separation. Richard finally turned back toward her, his expression no longer shaped by the presence of the crowd, but by something more internal and unsettled. He slowly removed the folded letter from his jacket pocket and placed it on the table between them without opening it again. Ava's eyes followed the movement, but she did not approach the table. Instead, she remained where she stood, as if understanding that the distance between them was still part of the conversation. Richard pulled out a chair, but did not sit immediately. He rested one hand on the back of it, looking at her with a focus that had shifted from observation to inquiry. "I need to understand something," he said at last, his voice steady but no longer detached. Ava tilted her head slightly, acknowledging the statement without interruption. Richard glanced briefly at the letter again, then back at her. "That letter was not random," he continued. "Someone deliberately made sure it reached me through you." The words were not framed as accusation, but as an attempt to construct meaning from what he had seen. Ava did not confirm or deny. Instead, she took a small step forward, closing the distance between herself and the table, though still maintaining space between her and Richard. "I was told to give it to you," she said simply. Richard studied her face carefully, searching for hesitation or inconsistency, but found none. The certainty in her voice did not feel rehearsed, it felt carried. He pulled out the chair and finally sat down, leaning slightly forward with his elbows near the edge of the table. The shift in posture reduced the distance of authority between them, making the room feel less hierarchical and more uncertain. Outside the windows, the city continued its movement, indifferent to the stillness inside. Richard tapped his fingers once on the surface of the table, then stopped. "Who told you to bring it here?" he asked. Ava hesitated briefly, not from confusion, but from memory. "Someone who used to work for you," she replied. The answer caused a subtle change in Richard's expression, not recognition yet, but the beginning of alignment between past and present that had not been connected before. He leaned back slightly, processing the implication without immediately reacting. The name that might have followed the statement remained unspoken, yet it lingered in the space between them. Ava's gaze did not shift away from him, and in that steady contact, Richard began to realize that she was not simply a messenger, but a deliberate part of the message itself. He reached again toward the letter but stopped just before touching it, as if reconsidering the moment of revelation. The room remained quiet, but the silence had changed shape. It was no longer empty. It was waiting. Richard finally spoke again, more slowly this time. "You understand what is inside this affects more than just tonight," he said. Ava nodded once, as if she had always understood that fact. The statement did not carry fear or anticipation, only acceptance. Richard looked at her for a long moment, then toward the city beyond the window, as if measuring the scale of what had entered his controlled environment. The gala, the guests, the expectations, all of it now felt distant from the reality forming in this room. When he turned back, his expression had shifted into something more resolved. He did not open the letter yet. Instead, he stood up again and walked toward the window, placing distance between himself and the object on the table while still keeping it in sight. Ava remained still, watching him, as the moment settled into a new phase that neither of them had fully defined, but both of them now recognized could not be reversed. Richard Hale stood near the floor-to-ceiling window of the private office, his reflection faintly layered over the city lights of Manhattan stretching endlessly beyond the glass. The folded letter still rested on the table behind him, untouched for several minutes, as if its presence alone was enough to hold the room in tension. Ava Johnson remained where she had stopped, quietly observing him without urgency, her small figure contrasting sharply with the controlled precision of the space around them. The silence between them had evolved again, no longer uncertain or suspended, but weighted with anticipation. Richard finally exhaled slowly, turning away from the window and walking back toward the table. He did not sit this time. Instead, he stopped just behind the chair, placing one hand on its back while looking down at the letter as if it had become more than paper. Ava's gaze followed his movement, steady and unbroken. "You said someone who used to work for me gave this to you," Richard said, his voice measured, careful not to distort meaning with emotion. Ava nodded once. "She said you would not believe it if it came any other way," she replied. The phrasing caused a subtle shift in Richard's expression, not confusion exactly, but recognition of intention behind the words. He leaned forward slightly, his attention narrowing. "What did she tell you about me?" he asked. Ava hesitated, not because she was unsure, but because she was recalling something precise. "She said you listen when something is already too late," she answered. The sentence lingered in the air longer than expected. Richard did not respond immediately. Instead, he slowly pulled out the chair and finally sat down, his movements no longer controlled by posture alone, but by thought. Outside the window, a helicopter passed in the distance, its lights briefly crossing the glass before disappearing into the night skyline. The city remained indifferent, continuing its rhythm without acknowledgement of what was unfolding inside the room. Richard's hand rested near the letter again, but he still did not open it. Instead, he studied Ava more carefully, as if trying to connect her presence to something that existed before this moment. "How long have you known her?" he asked. Ava looked down briefly, then back up. "Since she worked at the shelter," she said. The word shelter altered the tone in the room slightly, grounding the conversation in something less abstract. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in calculation, as he began aligning fragments of information that had not previously intersected. He leaned back in the chair, one hand now resting on the edge of the table. "And she gave you this letter recently?" he continued. Ava nodded again. "She said it needed to be delivered tonight, at the event, when everyone was watching." The specificity of that instruction added another layer to the situation, transforming what had felt like an unexpected encounter into something deliberately structured. Richard looked down at the letter once more, then slowly placed his fingertips on the edge of the fold without opening it. His voice lowered slightly. "Did she tell you what was inside?" Ava shook her head once. "She said you would understand when you saw it." Richard's jaw tightened slightly at the answer, not out of frustration, but out of recognition that the control he was accustomed to exercising over situations was no longer fully available here. He finally opened the letter again, this time more deliberately, unfolding it completely and scanning its contents without speaking. As his eyes moved across the page, the stillness in the room deepened further. Ava remained silent, watching him carefully now, not with expectation, but with awareness that the moment had reached a threshold. Richard's expression changed gradually, not dramatically, but enough that the weight of what he was reading became visible in the way his focus tightened and then steadied. He did not look up immediately after finishing. Instead, he kept his gaze on the page for several seconds longer than necessary, as if confirming that the words would not change if he read them again. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before. "She should not have involved you in this," he said, though it was unclear whether he was speaking to Ava or to the absence of the person who had sent her. Ava stepped forward slightly, closing the distance to the table, but not touching it. "She said I was the only one you would not ignore," she replied. The statement settled heavily between them, not accusatory, but factual in tone. Richard set the letter down slowly, aligning it carefully with the edge of the table, a habit that now seemed more controlled than necessary. He looked at Ava again, and this time the silence between them carried a different kind of understanding, not yet resolution, but acknowledgement that the evening had shifted into something far beyond its original boundaries. The city lights continued to move beyond the glass, but inside the room, everything had paused at the point where the truth had begun to take shape without fully revealing itself. The silence inside the private office no longer felt like emptiness, but like something that had been filled with meaning too heavy to be immediately spoken. Richard Hale remained seated at the table, the folded letter now resting in front of him, aligned precisely as if order could restore control over what it contained. Ava Johnson stood across from him, her posture unchanged, her attention steady, as though the conversation had not reached an end but a turning point that required patience rather than reaction. Richard finally leaned back slightly, his eyes no longer on the paper but on her. "You said she believed I would not ignore this if I saw it directly," he said slowly, repeating the idea not as confirmation, but as an attempt to understand its structure. Ava nodded once. "She said you only respond when something cannot be avoided anymore," she replied. The words carried no accusation, only observation, and that made them land differently in the quiet room. Richard exhaled through his nose, looking briefly toward the window where the Manhattan skyline remained unchanged, indifferent to the private shift occurring inside a single room above it. He tapped his fingers once on the table, then stopped, as if breaking a habit before it became distraction. "And you believe her," he said, not as a challenge, but as a clarification. Ava did not hesitate. "Yes," she answered simply. That single word created a pause that neither of them immediately filled. Richard looked down at the letter again, then slowly slid it a few inches closer to himself without opening it further. His expression tightened slightly, not in anger, but in concentration, as if the contents had already begun to extend beyond the page into consequences he was still mapping. Ava took a small step forward, stopping just short of the table edge, her eyes now shifting between him and the paper. "She said you would try to make it about business," she added quietly. "But it is not about that." Richard looked up at her sharply at that, not because of the content itself, but because of the precision with which it anticipated him. For the first time, his confidence in reading situations felt interrupted rather than authoritative. He stood up again, walking a few steps away from the table, then turning back as if distance might allow clarity. The city outside the window continued to glow with uninterrupted motion, traffic lines, and building lights forming a constant reminder of systems that functioned regardless of individual disruption. Inside the room, however, everything had narrowed to 2 points of attention: the letter and the child who delivered it. Richard finally spoke again, his voice quieter than before. "If this involves what I think it involves," he said carefully, "then it was not safe for her to send you." Ava's expression remained steady, but something in her eyes shifted slightly, not fear, but acknowledgement of weight. "She said it was already not safe for her," she replied. The statement hung in the air without elaboration, and Richard did not immediately respond. Instead, he returned to the table and sat down again, this time slower, as if the act required more consideration than before. He looked at the letter for a long moment without touching it, then finally opened it again, not fully reading, but scanning specific lines as though searching for confirmation of something already suspected. His jaw tightened briefly, then relaxed. He placed the letter down carefully, this time not as an object of control, but as something that had completed its immediate purpose. Ava watched him closely now, her attention no longer passive but attentive to change. Richard leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. "You should not be involved in this any further," he said, his tone shifting into something more deliberate. Ava did not move. "She said you would say that," she replied. A faint pause followed, and for the first time, Richard did not immediately counter. Instead, he studied her, not as a messenger alone, but as someone who had been placed intentionally within a sequence of events he was only now beginning to see as connected. The room remained quiet except for the distant hum of the city beyond the glass. Richard finally stood again, this time moving toward a cabinet near the wall, opening it, and retrieving a plain folder. He placed it on the table beside the letter without explanation. Ava's gaze followed the motion, but she did not ask what it was. Richard looked at her again, his expression now steadier, but no longer detached. "If what you delivered is accurate," he said slowly, "then this evening is only the beginning of something that will not stay in this room." Ava nodded once, as if that outcome had already been accounted for before she arrived. The silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was preparatory, and in that preparation, both of them remained still, aware that whatever came next would no longer be contained by assumption or expectation. The room had settled into a different kind of silence, one that no longer felt like hesitation, but like the stillness before a decision is made. Richard Hale stood near the table again, his hand resting lightly on the edge of the folder he had placed beside the letter. The Manhattan skyline beyond the glass continued its constant glow, but inside the office, time felt compressed into a narrow space where every movement carried meaning. Ava Johnson remained in the same position she had chosen earlier, not near the door, not retreating, but not advancing either, as if she understood that the next moment belonged entirely to observation. Richard finally spoke, his voice steady but no longer detached. "This situation cannot remain private," he said slowly, as if confirming a conclusion he had already reached but had not yet allowed himself to say aloud. Ava did not react immediately, only listening with the same calm focus she had maintained from the beginning. Richard continued, shifting his attention briefly toward the folder before looking back at her. "If what is inside that letter is accurate, then there are names, decisions, and actions that extend far beyond what was presented tonight." The words were not dramatic, but they carried weight, the kind that changes the structure of a room without raising volume. Ava nodded once, acknowledging without interruption. "She said you would need to decide quickly," she replied quietly. Richard exhaled, turning away from the table and walking a few steps toward the window again. This time, however, he did not look outside immediately. Instead, he stood facing the glass, his reflection overlapping the city lights, creating a layered image of control and uncertainty. Behind him, Ava remained still, watching without pressing forward. The silence stretched until Richard spoke again, this time more directly. "Did she tell you why you specifically?" he asked. Ava hesitated briefly, not out of confusion, but because the answer required precision. "She said I would not be questioned the same way adults would be," she answered. The simplicity of the response created a shift in Richard's expression, subtle but noticeable. He turned slightly, studying her again, this time with a different kind of focus, not as a bystander in a disrupted evening, but as someone beginning to recognize intentional placement within a larger sequence. He returned to the table and sat down once more, opening the folder he had placed earlier. Inside were printed documents, organized and structured, though he did not immediately reveal their contents. Instead, he placed them flat on the table without turning them toward Ava yet. "I have seen partial references to what is being implied here," he said carefully, choosing words that avoided assumption. "But confirmation changes responsibility." Ava looked at the documents but did not move closer. Her attention remained steady, not drawn to curiosity, but to understanding. Richard continued, his tone measured. "If this reaches public awareness, it will not remain contained within one organization, one event, or one explanation." He paused briefly, then added, "It will affect people who are not present in this room." Ava's expression did not change, but her eyes reflected acknowledgement of that weight. She spoke softly. "She said that is why it had to be you." The statement lingered longer than expected. Richard leaned back slightly, processing the implication not as emotional reaction, but as structural consequence. The letter, the folder, the presence of the child, all of it aligned into something deliberate rather than accidental. He finally pushed the documents slightly forward on the table, not toward her, but into shared visibility. "Then we proceed carefully," he said at last, his voice firming into resolution. Ava nodded once, as if accepting that instruction had been anticipated from the beginning. The city beyond the glass remained unchanged, but inside the office, the boundary between private decision and external consequence had already begun to dissolve, leaving both of them standing at the edge of something that could no longer remain confined to silence.